The corn was dying, and Robert McKenna knew he was dying with it. Standing in the middle of his 160-acre farm in Nebraska Territory, watching the brown stalks crackle in the merciless August heat of 1876, Robert felt the weight of 3 generations of farming legacy crumbling in his calloused hands. The drought had lasted 14 months now, longer than any old-timer could remember, and the McKenna farm that had fed 3 counties was about to become another casualty of the unforgiving frontier. But what Robert didn't know as he stared at his withering crop was that salvation would come from the people he had been taught to fear most. Because just 3 miles east of his farm, the Lakota band led by Chief Standing Bear had been watching the white farmers struggle with interest, and they possessed knowledge that could save both his harvest and his family's future. To understand how a desperate Irish farmer and a displaced Lakota tribe would forge an alliance that defied every social convention of 1876 Nebraska, you need to know about the promise Robert had made to his dying father and the wisdom the Lakota carried from generations of surviving on this same land. It was March 15, 1874, when Patrick McKenna called his son to his deathbed in their small farmhouse. The elder McKenna had homesteaded this land in 1863, breaking prairie that had never known a plow, building a life from nothing but sweat and stubborn Irish determination. Robert Patrick wheezed, his once powerful voice reduced to a whisper. "This land is in your blood now. Your grandfather died fighting English landlords for the right to farm his own soil. I came to America so you could have what we never could in Ireland, land that belongs to you, that can't be taken away." Robert knelt beside his father's bed, seeing in the old man's eyes the same fierce pride that had driven the McKenna family through poverty, persecution, and the brutal early years of frontier farming. "Promise me," Patrick continued, "that you'll never sell this land to speculators or cattle barons. Promise me you'll keep it for farmers, for people who understand that soil is sacred, that growing food is the most honest work a man can do." Robert made that promise, never imagining that honoring it would require him to challenge every assumption he had about who could be trusted and who deserved to work the land. By the summer of 1876, Robert was 28 years old, married to Sarah Henderson from the neighboring county, and father to 6-year-old Patrick and 4-year-old Mary. The McKenna farm had grown to 160 acres of prime agricultural land, producing corn, wheat, and vegetables that supplied not just their family but much of the surrounding territory. But the drought that began in June 1875 had tested every farming technique Robert knew. He had dug deeper wells, tried different planting patterns, even attempted dry farming methods he had read about in agricultural journals. Nothing worked. The aquifer that had sustained the region for decades was dropping faster than anyone had anticipated, and conventional farming wisdom seemed powerless against the relentless heat. As his crops withered and his savings dwindled, Robert faced the same choice that had driven dozens of other farmers from the territory: sell the land to cattle ranchers who could survive dry years better than crop farmers, or watch his family face starvation. The pressure to sell was enormous. James Morrison, the largest cattle rancher in 3 counties, had been making increasingly generous offers for the McKenna land. Morrison's latest proposal would have given Robert enough money to relocate his family to a wetter climate and start over with a substantial nest egg. "It's not defeat, Robert," Morrison had argued during his most recent visit. "It's adaptation. This land was meant for cattle, not crops. The buffalo knew it, the Indians knew it, and now you're learning it. Take my offer and save your family the suffering." But Robert couldn't forget his father's words about keeping the land for farmers, about the sacredness of growing food rather than raising animals for slaughter. He had also heard stories about what happened to small farmers who sold their land to cattle barons, how entire communities disappeared, how schools and churches closed when the population that supported them moved away. The breaking point came on August 3, 1876, when Robert discovered that his last irrigation attempt had failed completely. The emergency well he had spent their final savings to dig had come up dry after only 3 days of pumping. Standing in his cornfield, Looking at stalks that were already turning brown despite being weeks away from harvest, Robert felt the full weight of his impossible situation. That's when he saw the smoke rising from the hills 3 miles to the east. Robert had known there was a Lakota band camped in that direction, but like most white settlers, he had avoided any contact with them. The relationship between farmers and local tribes was complicated in 1876 Nebraska. The Lakota weren't officially at war with the settlers, but tensions were high following conflicts in other territories, and most white communities preferred to pretend the Native Americans didn't exist. But as Robert watched the smoke rising from the Lakota camp, he found himself thinking about something his father had told him years earlier about the potato famine in Ireland. The English landlords had plenty of food, Patrick had said, but they wouldn't share it with Irish farmers because they thought we were beneath them. Pride and prejudice can starve people just as surely as drought or disease. Looking at his dying crop, Robert made a decision that would have shocked every white farmer in the territory. He was going to ask the Lakota for help. The walk to the Lakota camp took Robert across terrain he had never explored, through rolling hills covered with native prairie grass that seemed to be surviving the drought better than his cultivated crops. As he got closer to the camp, he could see why the Lakota had chosen this location. There were signs of water, green vegetation, and careful land management that spoke of generations of experience. The Lakota who greeted Robert's approach were initially suspicious but not hostile. These were people who had been living on the margins of white settlement for years, maintaining their traditional ways while adapting to the changing world around them. They recognized Robert as the farmer from the valley, and they had been aware of his struggles with the drought. Chief Standing Bear was a man in his 50s, with intelligent eyes and the bearing of someone accustomed to making difficult decisions. When Robert was brought before him, the chief listened carefully as Robert explained his situation through a young Lakota man named Joseph who spoke both English and Lakota. "You want us to teach you our ways," Chief Standing Bear said after Robert had finished speaking. "But your people have told us that our ways are wrong, that only white farming methods can make the land productive. Why should we help you succeed where you say we would fail?" Robert was quiet for a long moment, recognizing the justice in the chief's question. When he answered, he spoke with an honesty that surprised even himself. "Because I've been stupid," Robert said simply. "I've been trying to force this land to be something it's not, instead of learning what it wants to be. My father always told me that the soil is sacred, but I've been treating it like it should serve me instead of the other way around." Chief Standing Bear studied Robert's face, looking for signs of sincerity or deception. What he saw was a desperate man, but also a man who was willing to admit he had been wrong. "Your crops are dying because you fight the land instead of working with it," the chief said finally. "You dig deep holes looking for water that isn't there, instead of finding the water that is there. You plant seeds that need much water in ground that has little water. Can you teach me?" Robert asked. "Can you show me how to work with the land instead of against it?" What followed was the beginning of an agricultural education that would transform not just Robert's farming methods but his understanding of how human beings could live sustainably on the land. Chief Standing Bear assigned Joseph, who was about Robert's age and had grown up learning both traditional Lakota agricultural techniques and observations of white farming methods, to serve as Robert's teacher. Over the following weeks, Joseph showed Robert techniques that had allowed the Lakota to thrive on the Great Plains for generations. The first lesson was about water. Instead of trying to bring water to his crops through deep wells and irrigation systems, Robert learned to identify the subtle signs of where water naturally accumulated and flowed across the landscape. The Lakota had techniques for reading the land that revealed water sources Robert had never noticed, places where snow collected in winter and seeped slowly into the ground, creating underground moisture that could sustain crops even during dry periods. The second lesson was about soil preparation. Lakota agricultural techniques involved working with the natural fertility cycles of the prairie, using controlled burning, careful timing of planting and harvesting, and selection of crops that complemented each other, rather than competing for the same nutrients. The third lesson was about crop selection. Instead of trying to grow European crops that had been developed for different climates, Robert learned about indigenous varieties of corn, beans, and squash that had been adapted over centuries to thrive in exactly the conditions he was facing. But the most important lesson was about patience and observation. Lakota farming wasn't about imposing a plan on the land, but about understanding the land's natural rhythms and working within them. White farmers try to make every year the same, Joseph explained as they walked through areas where traditional crops were thriving despite the drought. But every year is different. Some years the land wants to rest, some years it wants to grow. You have to listen to what the land is telling you. By early September, Robert was seeing results that seemed almost miraculous. Using Lakota techniques, he had managed to save about 30% of his corn crop and plant fast-growing indigenous vegetables that would provide food for his family through the winter. It wasn't a full harvest, but it was enough to survive, and more importantly, it was proof that different approaches to farming could work. But the real test of the relationship between Robert and the Lakota came when Chief Standing Bear made an unexpected proposal. "Winter will be hard for my people," the chief told Robert during one of their regular meetings. "The government promises of food and supplies have not come. We have knowledge that can help your farming, but we need food to survive until spring. Perhaps we can help each other." What Chief Standing Bear was proposing was a formal partnership. The Lakota would continue teaching Robert sustainable farming techniques and help him implement them across his entire farm. In exchange, Robert would share his harvest with the tribe, providing grain and vegetables that would supplement their traditional food sources during the difficult winter months. For Robert, this was both an opportunity and a massive risk. The partnership would solve his farming problems and honor his father's belief in the sacredness of agriculture. But it would also make him a target for white settlers who viewed any cooperation with Native Americans as betrayal. Robert's answer came from remembering his father's stories about the Irish potato famine and the lesson that pride and prejudice could starve people just as surely as natural disasters. "Yes," Robert told Chief Standing Bear. "But I want this to be more than just an emergency arrangement. I want to learn your methods well enough to teach them to other farmers. And I want to make sure that this partnership continues even after the drought ends." The agreement they reached that day established the first formal agricultural cooperation between white farmers and the Lakota in Nebraska Territory. Robert would dedicate a portion of his land to traditional Lakota crops, using indigenous farming methods. The Lakota would teach these methods to Robert and help him adapt them for larger-scale production. The harvest would be shared between Robert's family and the tribe, with both communities contributing labor and knowledge. The partnership proved successful beyond either side's expectations. By the end of 1876, the McKenna farm was producing more food per acre than it had ever produced before, using less water and requiring less intensive labor. The Lakota had reliable access to agricultural products that complemented their traditional diet and hunting practices. But the real challenge came when word of the partnership spread to the white farming community. The reaction was swift and harsh. Other farmers accused Robert of going native and betraying his own people. The local merchant refused to buy crops that had been tainted by Indian methods. Some neighbors stopped speaking to Robert's family entirely, and there were even threats of violence from settlers who viewed the partnership as dangerous precedent. The pressure intensified when James Morrison, the cattle rancher who had been trying to buy Robert's land, began spreading rumors that Robert's partnership with the Lakota was actually a cover for planning attacks on white settlements. "McKenna is giving them information about our farms, our weaknesses," Morrison told anyone who would listen. "He's teaching them how to destroy us from the inside." The rumors were false, but they were effective. Within weeks, Robert found himself isolated from the white community he had grown up in, treated as a traitor and a threat. The psychological pressure was enormous, particularly on Sarah, who faced social ostracism from other farm wives and worried about the safety of their children. The crisis came to a head in November 1876, when a group of white farmers led by Morrison demanded that Robert choose between his partnership with the Lakota and his place in the white community. "End this Indian business," Morrison demanded during a confrontation at Robert's farm. "Send them away," farm like a white man, and we'll forget this ever happened. But if you continue with this partnership, you'll find that white folks can make life very difficult for traitors. Robert's response surprised everyone, including himself. I'm not a traitor, he said calmly. I'm a farmer, and I've learned that the land doesn't care what color the hands are that work it. It only cares whether those hands understand what it needs. He gestured toward his fields, where the evidence of successful partnership was undeniable. Look at what we've accomplished. Look at the crops we've grown using methods that work with this land instead of against it. You're asking me to give up knowledge that could help all of us farm better just because of pride and prejudice. The confrontation ended without violence, but it marked the beginning of a difficult period for the McKenna family. They were effectively boycotted by the white farming community, cut off from social networks and commercial relationships that had sustained them for years. But the partnership with the Lakota provided more than just agricultural knowledge. Chief Standing Bear and his people offered the McKennas a different kind of community, one based on mutual respect and shared work rather than racial and cultural conformity. Joseph and his wife Mary Crowfeather became close friends with Robert and Sarah, sharing meals, child-rearing responsibilities, and the daily work of farming. The McKenna children learned to speak basic Lakota and participated in traditional games and storytelling. The Lakota children learned English and helped with European-style farming tasks. Over the winter of 1876 to 1877, this integrated community proved its resilience. When storms isolated the region for weeks at a time, the combined resources and knowledge of both cultures ensured that everyone had adequate food, shelter, and medical care. When spring came, they had not just survived but strengthened their bonds and improved their farming techniques. The success of the partnership began to attract attention from unexpected sources. Agricultural scientists from Eastern universities, interested in sustainable farming methods, visited the McKenna farm to study the integration of indigenous and European techniques. Government officials concerned about recurring drought cycles asked for reports on the methods that had proven successful. Most importantly, other farmers facing similar challenges began to quietly ask Robert for advice, even as they publicly maintained their distance from his partnership with the Lakota. By 1878, the McKenna farm had become a model for sustainable agriculture in the region. The techniques developed through the partnership were being studied and adapted by farmers across the territory, though few were willing to acknowledge the indigenous origins of the methods. Robert's commitment to honoring both his father's legacy and his partnership with the Lakota led him to establish what became known as the Nebraska Agricultural Cooperation Program. The program formally documented traditional Lakota farming methods, created educational materials for other farmers, and advocated for policies that recognized indigenous knowledge as a valuable resource for agricultural development. The program faced ongoing opposition from settlers who viewed any recognition of Native American knowledge as dangerous precedent, but it gradually gained support from practical farmers who cared more about results than politics. Chief Standing Bear lived to see the partnership between his people and the McKenna family become a model for cooperation between Native Americans and white settlers across the region. When he died in 1885, Robert spoke at his funeral, describing him as one of the greatest agricultural teachers he had ever known. Joseph succeeded Chief Standing Bear as leader of the band and continued the partnership with the McKenna family for the rest of his life. The cooperation agreement they had established became the foundation for the first formal treaty between the state of Nebraska and local Lakota communities that recognized indigenous land rights and cultural practices. Robert McKenna died in 1923, having transformed his 160-acre homestead into a 2,000-acre demonstration farm that attracted visitors from around the world. His methods, developed in partnership with Lakota knowledge keepers, had proven sustainable through multiple drought cycles and economic challenges. The McKenna-Lakota partnership proved that agricultural success didn't require cultural domination, that traditional knowledge and modern techniques could complement each other, and that cooperation across racial lines could benefit everyone involved. Today, the techniques developed through Robert McKenna's partnership with Chief Standing Bear's band are taught in agricultural programs around the world as examples of sustainable farming methods that work with natural systems rather than against them. The story of the shared harvest reminds us that wisdom can come from unexpected sources, that survival often requires us to challenge our prejudices, and that the greatest agricultural innovations happen when different cultures share their knowledge instead of guarding it jealously. Robert McKenna kept his promise to his father about treating the land as sacred, but he discovered that honoring that promise required him to learn from people his own culture had taught him to dismiss as primitive. In doing so, he proved that true agricultural success comes not from dominating the land, but from understanding it well enough to work as its partner rather than its master. The impact of the McKenna-Lakota partnership extended far beyond their immediate community, and became a catalyst for changing how the entire region approached agriculture and cross-cultural relations. By 1880, delegations from agricultural colleges across the Midwest were visiting the McKenna farm to study what they termed integrated indigenous European farming methods. William Harrison from the Iowa Agricultural College was among the first academic researchers to document the techniques that Robert and Joseph had developed together. His detailed reports, published in agricultural journals throughout the 1880s, provided scientific validation for farming methods that had been dismissed by mainstream agriculture as primitive Indian practices. What McKenna and his Lakota partners have accomplished, Dr. Harrison wrote in 1881, represents a fundamental breakthrough in sustainable agriculture. They have demonstrated that traditional indigenous knowledge, when combined with European agricultural science, can produce yields that exceed either approach used alone while requiring fewer external inputs and proving more resilient to environmental challenges. The scientific recognition of the partnership's success led to formal collaboration with state agricultural departments and the establishment of the first government-funded program to study and preserve indigenous farming knowledge. Robert found himself appointed as an official consultant to the Nebraska Agricultural Commission, tasked with documenting traditional methods and training other farmers in sustainable techniques. But the most significant impact of the partnership was its influence on a new generation of farmers who had grown up witnessing the success of cross-cultural cooperation. Many of the children who had played together on the McKenna farm during the late 1870s became leaders in their respective communities during the 1890s and early 1900s, carrying with them a fundamentally different understanding of what was possible between Native American and white communities. Thomas McKenna, Robert's son, became one of the most successful farmers in Nebraska by building on the techniques his father had learned from the Lakota. But more importantly, he established a tradition of hiring Native American agricultural consultants and ensuring that indigenous communities received fair compensation for sharing their traditional knowledge. Mary Crow Feather, Joseph's daughter, became the first Native American woman to receive formal agricultural training from the University of Nebraska. She returned to her community with both traditional knowledge and modern scientific understanding, helping to establish agricultural programs on reservations throughout the region. The partnership also influenced policy at the federal level. When Congress debated the General Allotment Act in 1887, Robert McKenna was invited to testify about alternatives to forced assimilation that could preserve Native American agricultural knowledge while allowing for integration with broader economic systems. The solution is not to make Indians into white farmers or to keep them completely separate, Robert told the Congressional Committee. The solution is to recognize that both cultures have valuable knowledge to contribute, and to create systems that allow for mutual benefit rather than domination by one side over the other. Although Robert's testimony did not prevent the passage of the Allotment Act, it did influence the inclusion of provisions that allowed some tribes to maintain traditional agricultural practices on their allotted lands, and it established precedents for recognizing indigenous intellectual property rights. The success of the McKenna-Lakota partnership during the 1880s attracted attention from other tribal communities facing similar challenges. Delegations from Cherokee, Choctaw, and Creek nations visited the Nebraska farm to study methods that could be adapted to their own territories and agricultural traditions. Each of these exchanges resulted in new innovations as different indigenous knowledge systems were combined with European techniques and adapted to different environmental conditions. Robert McKenna became a facilitator for these exchanges, helping to create networks of communication between tribes and progressive farmers across multiple states. The economic impact of these collaborations was substantial. Farms using integrated indigenous European methods consistently showed higher yields, lower costs, and greater resilience to environmental challenges than farms using conventional European-only techniques. Insurance companies began offering lower premiums to farmers who could demonstrate they were using proven sustainable methods. By 1890, what had started as a desperate farmer's request for help during a drought had evolved into a regional movement that was changing how agriculture was practiced across the Great Plains. The techniques developed through the McKenna-Lakota partnership were being taught in agricultural schools, implemented on large-scale farming operations, and adapted for use in different climates and soil conditions. But perhaps the most important legacy of the partnership was its demonstration that cooperation across racial and cultural lines could produce benefits that neither group could achieve alone. At a time when federal policy was focused on forced assimilation and cultural destruction, the McKenna farm proved that preservation of Native American knowledge and integration with broader economic systems were not mutually exclusive goals. The annual Harvest Festival that Robert and Chief Standing Bear had established in 1877 continued for decades, growing from a small celebration shared between two families into a regional event that attracted thousands of visitors. The festival featured demonstrations of traditional and modern farming techniques, cultural exchanges between different communities, and educational programs that taught children about both Native American and European agricultural traditions. During the 1890s, the Harvest Festival became a model for similar events across the country, helping to preserve indigenous cultural practices while also creating economic opportunities for Native American communities. The festival's success demonstrated that cultural preservation and economic development could support each other rather than competing. Robert McKenna's commitment to honoring both his father's legacy and his partnership with the Lakota led him to establish the McKenna Agricultural Institute in 1895. The institute was the first educational institution in the region to offer formal training in both European and indigenous farming methods, graduating students who went on to establish sustainable farming operations throughout the Midwest. The institute also served as a research center where traditional knowledge was documented, tested, and refined using modern scientific methods. This work helped preserve agricultural techniques that might otherwise have been lost while also providing scientific validation that increased their acceptance among skeptical farmers. Joseph Little Wolf, who had succeeded his father as the leader of the Lakota Band, worked closely with Robert to ensure that the institute respected indigenous intellectual property rights and that Native American communities received appropriate compensation for sharing their knowledge. Their collaboration established protocols that became models for ethical research partnerships between academic institutions and indigenous communities. The institute's most significant achievement was the development of drought-resistant crop varieties that combined indigenous seeds with European breeding techniques. These varieties, developed through collaboration between Lakota agricultural specialists and university researchers, proved crucial during the severe droughts of the 1930s and saved thousands of farms from bankruptcy. When Robert McKenna died in 1923, his funeral was attended by farmers, scientists, government officials, and tribal leaders from across the Midwest. The diversity of the mourners reflected the breadth of the communities that had been touched by his work and the partnerships he had helped create. The eulogy was delivered jointly by Thomas McKenna and Joseph Little Wolf's son, Robert Little Wolf, who had been named in honor of the white farmer who had helped change his people's relationship with the broader agricultural community. Their joint speech emphasized that Robert McKenna's greatest achievement was not the innovations he had developed, but the trust he had built between communities that had previously seen each other only as obstacles or enemies. Robert McKenna taught us that the land belongs to whoever understands it best, Robert Little Wolf said. He showed us that understanding comes not from books or tradition alone but from the willingness to listen to anyone who has learned to work with the earth rather than against it. The McKenna Agricultural Institute continued to operate for more than 50 years, training thousands of farmers and researchers in sustainable agricultural methods. Many of its graduates went on to establish similar programs in other regions, spreading the model of cross-cultural agricultural cooperation across the country. Today, the techniques developed through Robert McKenna's partnership with Chief Standing Bear's Lakota Band are recognized as foundational contributions to the development of sustainable agriculture in North America. Agricultural programs around the world study the McKenna-Lakota collaboration as an example of how traditional knowledge and modern science can be integrated to address environmental challenges. The original McKenna farm is now a National Historic Site, preserving both the physical landscape where the partnership developed and the documentary evidence of how two very different communities learned to work together for their mutual benefit. Visitors to the site can see demonstrations of both traditional Lakota farming methods and the integrated techniques that emerged from the collaboration. The story of the shared harvest serves as a reminder that some of the most important innovations come not from competition or domination but from the willingness to recognize that different cultures may have developed different solutions to the same fundamental challenges. Robert McKenna's decision to ask for help from people his own culture had taught him to fear led to discoveries that benefited everyone involved and created a model for cooperation that continues to influence agricultural development today. In an era when climate change and environmental degradation are forcing farmers around the world to reconsider their methods, the McKenna-Lakota partnership offers hope that sustainable solutions can be found through collaboration rather than conflict, and that the wisdom needed to work successfully with the land may already exist in communities that have been practicing sustainable agriculture for generations.